Welcome to day one of Truth and Reconciliation Week. Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Mohammed, and I am an RBC branch manager and co chair of the Employee Resource Group Royal Eagles for London Lambton and Southwest Ontario region. I would like to introduce Kluwani Adamak, who is the AFN Regional Chief for Yukon. She is a proud Northerner and citizen of the Kluwani First Nation. We are pleased to welcome you to this session, Yukon's story of self-government and values-based leadership, past and present.
Thank you, everyone, and so pleased to join you. I want to acknowledge the territory which I live, Kwanlin Dun and Ta'anquitch Council, and very pleased to join you virtually apart today. I really want to thank, of course, the organizers for the opportunity to join you. And just before I jump in to share some reflections on self-government, and especially at the beginning of this Truth and Reconciliation Week, important to share who I am and where I come from. Dunch A, Kluwani Adamek Uye, Daklawedi Ayahat, Ageo Hatu Asaug, Kluan Mankai Iche, Aswa, Agnes Johnson, Southern Shoshone Uye, Asia Russell Dixon, Tlingit Enach, Ama Patricia Adamek, Ata Gerald Dixon, Gunach Chish. What I shared with you was that I'm from Kluwani First Nation. This photo in the background is the traditional territory that I come from, Kluwani Lake, and important to acknowledge the lineage I come from. My grandmother, the late Agnes Johnson, who was a residential school survivor and who passed away this January. And she was Southern Shoshone, and my grandfather is Tlingit. And so in our way, the clans which we come from, true moieties, wolf and crow, it is important that you share that, and so people know exactly where you fit in terms of our community. So I'm from the Daklawedi, the Killer Whale clan, and my Tlingit name is Age. And Age, for those of you who may know a little bit about Yukon history, when the gold was discovered, it was actually a number of Tagish Kwan, Tagish people, of which one was my great uncle, Skookum Jim, and great aunt, Kate Carmack. And so their sister was Age. And so it is important to share, again, as I mentioned, who I am, where I come from. Because when we go into potlatch or into community, that's usually one of the first things that people will tend to ask you. So with that, I'm going to share some photos with you. I certainly feel that it is really important as we're having conversations together to also put together some imagery so that you can get a sense of sort of what it is that I'm speaking about. But the focus for this morning is, of course, or afternoon, wherever you may be, Yukon's story of self-government and values-based leadership, past and present. And so the first thing I want to share is a little bit about our history. So in the Yukon, there's 14 nations, and 11 of those nations have what's called final agreements. So there's a land claim agreement that's mirrored with a self-government agreement. Now, this was no easy feat back in the 1970s. And so I am going to challenge you to use Grandma Google today a little bit as we go. But in the 1970s, a group of our leaders went to Ottawa, and you know, this the position of our region was very much, you know, we're not here for a handout, we're here for what's rightfully ours. And so this manifesto that was put together, I call it a manifesto, but it was certainly a vision. And so you can Google that, together today for our children tomorrow, was the vision that our leaders had come up with together. And again, that being grounded in values, in who we are, in our culture, and certainly did outline a vision for each community, and at that time what people wanted to see. And it's a beautiful read. I really encourage you to take some time, and I will post or have my colleagues maybe post in the chat a link for Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. But again, that really was sort of the moment where our leaders went to Ottawa and met with them, with then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, to say, look, like, we have a vision and a plan, and we need partners. We're not here to ask permission. We're here to let you know what it is that that we see and the path that we see our people wanting to take. So that led to negotiations of what's called the Umbrella Final Agreement, which is an agreement that has 28 chapters. So all of those 11 nations that have a modern treaty in the Yukon have the same 28 chapters. So essentially they agreed on those same 28 chapters through a process. And then of course, each nation has differences with respect to the name, their self-government agreement, which mirrors that. So the land claim agreement, modern treaty, and then the self-government agreement. And the self-government agreement provides for, of course, those legislative powers. So what people might not know about Yukon First Nations is that where there may be a territorial law that exists, Yukon First Nations can develop their own law. And so then our law would supersede territorial law in our territory. So for example, that would include things like administration of justice. So processes for what isn't determined as, you know, criminal cases, but other, you know, legal infractions that may go through a different process. That also includes education. So the ability to fully draw down, again, when I say draw down, I mean take a program that's offered or legislation that's been developed territorially and then make our own. You see First Nations in the Yukon with their own Lands Acts, their own Laws of the People Act, their own Languages Act. So it's a very different, I would say, landscape with respect to the way that we look at self-determination. And the last thing I'll share that I think is very, very different, that those listening may not perhaps have had experience working in and for directly is the citizenship. And so citizenship, as we know across the country when it comes to First Nations, is very much determined by the Indian Act. And you know, some nations have gone beyond and been able to, you know, sort of look at different ways, different codes, or band council resolutions, for example. In the Yukon, with those 11 nations, that is certainly not the reality. The citizenship is determined by the nation. And so regardless of status, the nation determines who its members are. So for example, there are many nations in the Yukon that have members who are not status Indians. And from a Yukon First Nation perspective, that is because it isn't the federal government who determines who our people are. And so, you know, I often share the reflection that you know, I am a status Indian, but wasn't always, you know, as concerned, I think, as a lot of other friends who are First Nation and status, and maybe from different parts of the country, about who I may choose to have children with, because my children will always be Kluane First Nation, and their children will be Kluane First Nation. So I think that's where we get into a really different reality, because of course we know the federal government and Indian Act bans, right? It is very much about status. And so in the Yukon, we've moved beyond the Indian Act. And so I think it is important to share that there are, as you see, there's 14 First Nations and 11 self-governing agreements. There are 3 nations who chose to not pursue this path. And I think that's a really important reflection to share, is that those nations, for many different reasons, chose to not sign the Umbrella Final Agreement. And largely questions and concerns around implementation of these agreements, right? So there's, you know, treaties 1 to 11 right across the country, and a lot of concern that I hear from nations or from citizens and people that are part of international or number treaties, you know, how has the government implemented those? And so when we look to a modern context, we still have implementation issues, even though these agreements were signed, you know, between sort of like in and around 1982 and onward. So I think this is where, or sorry, 1993 and onward. I think this is where it's really, really important that, those nations that we ensure, and this is the role and responsibility of our regional office, is to ensure that all First Nations are supported and that their interests are, of course, always at the forefront. And so when we talk about our self-government agreements, right, those 11, we do know that there's ongoing conversations with many nations across the country about looking at developing additional agreements, and those agreements being forged by and for the people. And so that's what I think is really important is, we've always had inherent rights. And so it is really, really important that nations determine how they see those rights being honored and respected, and of course, agreements being honored and respected and implemented. And so that's a bit of a, I would say, Coles Notes version. We could probably spend our whole time talking specifically about the agreements, but I do encourage you to take a look at Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, because there's certainly a lot of really, really, I would say, just some incredible, visionary perspectives from, 1973 that are still so real for today. And so that, is certainly something that I wanted to share with you. And when we talk about, the land, one thing that in terms of our land claim agreements that I may just speak to, again, those 11 who have chosen to pursue that path, is there's different types of specified land. So the way that one of our, I would say, legal masterminds in the Yukon, Dave Joe, sort of explained it was, we took Section 35 rights and defined them on our own terms. And so there's different categories of land. There's category A land that, provides for surface and subsurface rights, and then category B land that is subsurface rights. And then there's our traditional territory that does include other lands, which would now be determined more as crown land, but where there are specific processes as it relates to development. And so this is an example of the Peel watershed that you'll see here, and many of you may have seen, and if not, I encourage you to do some of your own research on the Peel watershed. But essentially, there was a really huge legal victory in the Yukon in relation to the Peel watershed, because there was of course, a process which was agreed upon as part of our agreements that the territorial government didn't honor and acknowledge. And so essentially, this went to went through the legal process, and pretty remarkable to see that historic win by Yukon First Nations. And so, speaking to what it is that, and who we are, we also think about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is sort of in northern Alaska. But the porcupine caribou herd, beautiful story. If you can visualize sort of like Alaska and Yukon and the Northwest Territories, all of the different places where Gwich'in people primarily live now are sort of in and around the way in which the caribou travel. And so when I sort of looked at a map and saw their different migration patterns, and then realized that, when Gwich'in people say we are a caribou people, they are very much a caribou people. They entirely, depend on and have sustained this beautiful relationship with the caribou, because the caribou has continued to feed their people for thousands and thousands of years. And so, certainly when you go to a community like Old Crow, the Vantak Gwich'in, and Vadzai is how you say caribou in Gwich'in, that you see that relationship sort of being embedded throughout the different ways in which governance, self-determination, self-government is actually implemented and honored. And so it is, again, when we talk about values, and when we talk about land rights, certainly, there's some incredible examples of Yukon First Nations who have continued to advance those rights by way of the legal measures, which isn't always, of course, as we know, the route that First Nations want to take. But unfortunately, that has been the position that we have been put in as Indigenous peoples. And so we'll continue to press for change, whether it be through the judicial processes or through other measures. But I did want to highlight these two examples of leadership on the ground and ways that our agreements have continued to support people. The next examples here that I wanted to share, Yukon First Nations, as it relates to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, regionally, we decided as a region that it was time for us to take a different approach, knowing that the National Action Plan would be developed. The region, so in partnership with the territorial government, the three Indigenous women's organizations, and then of course, Yukon First Nations leadership and the leadership of our federal and territorial partners developed changing the path moving forward. And it's a strategy that was developed as a whole Yukon approach in response to the 231 calls to justice. And so again, when we think about self-determination, that also includes, beyond the scope of land claim or minor treaty agreements, that's also, carving out and determining the path moving forward on your own terms. And so, that also includes examples such as the Yukon First Nation Board framework that's being developed to establish our own school board. So for those of you who may not know, all of our students go to public school in the Yukon. There isn't a First Nation school. And so this is something that our leaders have been pushing for a very long time, in that when the residential schools were shut down, so to speak, the First Nation students were all put into public schools because the Yukon doesn't have the same type of reserve reality that we see across the country. It's more land set aside, or now, as I mentioned and talked about our agreement, settlement land. So forging a new path on our terms, that our kids have always gone to public school. And so this has been a huge issue for our leaders because it's not providing the educational outcomes for our students that we would be expecting. And so there is a new path as it relates to advancing self-determination on our terms, and looking to build and create a system, an educational experience, I should say, for First Nation students that makes sense for them. And so, that is another example of how, Yukon First Nations continue to lead. We've developed a climate fellowship, www.yfnclimate.ca. And that fellowship was created for and by First Nations. So territorial government put out its climate plan, the federal government put out its climate plan, and Yukon First Nation said, wait a minute, there's some things that are very positive here, but there's a lot missing. And so we're going to create our own. And so this group, this photo of sort of in the middle highlights a few of our climate fellows that are embarking on creating a new path forward as it relates to climate action, and really focused on reconnection. And so those are some of the examples that I wanted to share, in that, this has been, I would say the Yukon has a story of a Yukon that leads, that we advance solutions on our terms. And it's not about asking for permission, but rather it's about forging the path forward based on who we are. And so, as we come to sort of some closing reflections before we go into questions and discussion, this photo that you'll see is a number of leaders. This was taken a little while ago when I first began my term as regional chief. And, it's been so moving to see our region advance in ways that are entirely grounded in who we are. And, that also includes incorporating some of the traditional protocols into the ways that we make decisions. And so when I sort of started off the beginning of my presentation and shared with you the clan I'm from, for example, there are nations of which you see a number of leaders in the photograph who that is the way in which their governance functions. It is entirely based on clan. So the clan has representatives that attend and make decisions, and all the decisions essentially will go back to the clan for discussion. And when I mean clan, I mean, you know, the clan I talked about being from the Ducklawady clan. There's many other clans, and so this is where it really is, I think, the Yukon story is a story of innovation, is a story of leadership, is a story of leading from a place of values. So again, we will partner with territorial, with federal, with the business community, but certainly it needs to be done in a way that is respectful and that honors who we are. And so for those who have had a chance to go to the Yukon, you'll see physically a lot of examples of that in terms of partnerships with buildings. You'll see a lot of, you know, ownership of different, you know, downtown locations and properties that are owned by Yukon First Nation Development Corporations. So the Yukon, you know, has a beautiful story, and one that isn't always easy. You know, it's this week especially, it's very hard. There were schools, a residential school, Chutla, as well as a school up in Dawson, St. Mary's. And if for those Yukoners, I might have got that incorrectly. I can't remember if it's St. Mary's or another one of the saints, but I do, you know, feel that despite it all, and you know, a number of leaders who we know have gone through that experience themselves, or more recently through the child welfare system, that, you know, there's still a whole lot of incredible work and innovation that's been done. And so the more that we can support nations to advance their path forward on their terms, the more that we're going to see sort of that healing and that important work continue. And so really it is about the responsibilities that we have to and for the land, the water, and the animals, but also as peoples who have had for thousands and thousands of years our own ways of governing and taking care of each other, and taking care and being caretakers of the land. And so I think with that, I'll take a pause, and I look forward to questions and to sort of some more dialogue and conversation as we move through the rest of our time together.
Thank you, Chief Adamak. Thank you for your powerful words. Thank you for sharing all that very strong information with us. So we will open it up for some questions now. If there's any students who would like to ask Chief Adamak some questions, please share some with us. So Chief Adamak, what would you say if you're speaking to the young students today, what can they do to have more involvement in leadership to really bring these causes to the forefront and make a difference? How can you encourage them?
Well, you know, I think that one of the first things people need to do is to familiarize themselves with, you know, where they live, whose territory that is, what's the history there? Was there a residential school there? You know, what happened? And sort of thinking about it like, wherever you may be, like what happened here like 10, 20, 30, 40, 100, 200, 250 years ago? Because I think the moment that we can start to think about the place and space that we're in as something that, and again, I come from an Indigenous and a non-Indigenous background. So like my grandfather immigrated here in the 50s after the Second World War. And then I've got, you know, and who's German. And then I've got my grandmother, who I talked about, who had passed away, who's First Nation and went to residential school, and like two totally different lived experiences at the same time. Really important for, you know, my grandfather to have, and my family, my non-Indigenous family, to have developed a stronger understanding of sort of, you know, the impacts that and it is, I think it's important to know that, you know, residential schools, and you know, we could sort of shy away from this term, but we've also, you know, heard the Prime Minister say it, like it was a genocide that happened. Like we learn about the Holocaust, we learn about you know, the apartheid in Africa, and like it happened here, and it didn't happen that long ago. So, you know, like I said, like my grandmother went to residential school. So this is where I think it is, and I've seen a lot, and I have a lot of friends who feel like, well, I just feel bad and I feel guilty. Like, I didn't do it. Why should I feel bad? And it's like, well, no, you didn't do it. But what are you going to do to make sure it never happens again? And so that requires you to be have courage and to be willing to look at our country a lot differently, like beyond the like celebration of Canada. And when people travel, they have a Canada flag on their backpack, and like everyone, generally speaking, Canada is known as this very like, embracing and welcoming nation. Well, Canada has a dark history that was hidden specifically because it didn't want to be shared. They didn't want to share that history. But now we have a responsibility as all Canadians, Indigenous Canadians and non-Indigenous Canadians, and especially non-Indigenous Canadians, to take that time to learn it, because it's a history that, we as Indigenous people shouldn't have to feel the burden of. And I understand that it feels uncomfortable. At the same time, you got to think about and have some empathy for those who have been carrying those dark chapters on their own for a really long time. So
Yes.
familiarize yourself with the TRC calls to justice or the TRC calls to action, the calls to justice. Read Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. It's beautiful. And take the time to learn about where you live and what was really the history there.
Very powerful words. Thank you. So we do have a question here. So what are you envisioning for the First Nation education in the Yukon?
Well, certainly that the question I think that's important here is, what does education need to look like? And I certainly have my own, reflections and opinions, but I'm very mindful that it is the leadership, the chiefs, right, that make that determination through the guidance of their advisors and so on. I would love to see First Nations being able to go to school, go to learn, I should say, not necessarily a school. I would like to see students being able to learn their language, to have, culture embedded in all parts of sort of mainstream curriculum, and having students go through, the sort of 12 years of what we would frame as like a sort of Western colonial education, but go through a process where we're also able to celebrate and honor their strengths. And I think that's where, and I think this could be said for all students. There's a lot of inconsistencies in the public education system, and so how do we reassess based in the times we're in, and moving into more of a, I would say, technological world, but balance that from an Indigenous perspective with culture, and making sure that there's elders in the schools and that students have the supports that they need.
Okay. This is also from another student. What would you say are the next steps for reconciliation in Yukon, specifically for the Yukon?
Well, I would like to see, in the same way that I talked about that missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, our own Yukon strategy. I would love to see our own strategy as it relates to reconciliation with all partners. Because I think, again, I talk about the 94 calls to action. You can take those 94 calls to action and apply them to each region, and to actually start to measure, okay, how far have we come, right? Have we actually moved the mark on some of these pieces or not? And that's something that I would like to see. I would like to see more. And I think that it is really hard because there's a whole lot of history that people might not be comfortable with learning, that I would like to see the public education system continue to grow and expand how it, of course, shares the true history of this country.
And looking forward, of course, to make any kind of change, it always starts with our students. So if you were to go back to yourself in grade 8, what advice would you give yourself?
Hmm. Um,
What would you
that's
do
funny you mentioned.
differently?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't really have a whole ton of time, but I also, on a personal level, do feel that struggle of reconciliation because of my background. I'm Indigenous and non-Indigenous.
Mhm.
And I, for any of those Indigenous students out there who may sort of be at a place where you're starting to like want to learn more and put yourself in a position to, spend more time with others, I would say to do that. Grade 8 was a time that I didn't spend and wasn't able to, I would say, connect in those kind of ways. So I would say in grade 8, I would probably tell myself that there's a hard way or a harder way. And the harder way is to not dive into what feels hard and tough. The harder way will be if you don't dive into what feels hard and tough, then it's just going to be harder later on.
Very good advice. And what is the biggest challenge in your community? And what is the biggest advantage or asset to your community?
Um, well, I would say, we're still dealing with, and I know this is heavy, but I am, I would say,
Mhm.
one that wants to have heavy and hard conversations because that's the way we're going to move. There's been a lot of overdoses and a lot of suicide, and it's been really hard. A lot of young men in my own community that have passed away far too soon. And I really feel that that is something that we have to address in this generation, health and mental wellness. And like when you are perhaps dealing with depression or anxiety, I've dealt with both. So for those students who might have had their own experiences with anxiety, I know how that feels. um, I've not experienced what I would say in terms of addictions, what some of my brothers and sisters at home have. And so I don't know how that feels. And so I think it's, we need to be empathetic as we're dealing with these very hard situations like overdoses and suicide.
Mhm.
At the same time, what is our biggest strength? I think it's our culture and our language. Like the more that people feel connected with who they are and where they come from, and that sense of pride and courage, we've seen there's data to show it, but our elders also talk about it. That's where we're going to see that real change. And so that's where it requires us to think differently in terms of how we look at school or education. It requires us to be approaching things very differently, and to ensure that culture and language are sort of and children are at the center of everything we do.
Yes, so ties to the community is very, very important. So, how many people are involved in your community's leadership, and how is it generally structured within the community?
Well, yeah, like I sort of shared, there's 14 different nations, and so each of those nations have like a speaker of the people or a chief. And so um, most all of those are through an elected process. So the citizens will elect their chief and or their council. But one nation actually is a very different nation where I talked about that traditional governance structure. So they have 5 clans. And so those clans each determine who their clan representative is. So there's 5. And then it was the clans that also determined their Nashada Hene, their speaker of the people. So it wasn't so much about voting, right, as we might look at sort of the democratic institutions that exist, across the country, federally, territorially, municipally. But at the same time, that nation actually just made a really big step to say, look, that means if you're not part of your clan structure, that you may not have a voice for who is representing you. And so they've moved to an elected process for their Nashada Hene, their chief, but the clan representatives are still determined by the clan.
Yeah.
Then you have other nations that have, and maybe just a closing reflection on that. My nation has an actual elected youth counselor. So somebody between the age of 18 to 25 that will be elected to be the voice for the youth. And there's the same for an elder. And then we have a chief and 2 other council members. So each nation is very different in terms of its governance and how decisions are made.
Okay. And from another student, how long have you been chief?
So I was appointed as the interim for like a 6-month period because our last regional chief sadly had passed away after a battle with cancer. So I was appointed. There were 6 of us who submitted our interest, and I was appointed for 6 months. And then I decided to run in the election in June of 2018, and I was acclaimed. And so I've been serving for like almost, closer to 4 years. And my election for this role is in November, which would be for another 3-year term.
Okay. And this is from a student. What support groups are available for people who have been through residential schools?
Well, I know that if you go on like Twitter or Instagram, you'll see a lot of like the TRC and IRS. IRS means Indian Residential Schools. There's like call lines and helplines. Some communities have really been able to advance like healing and wellness camps. But what I will say is that there's a lot that's needed. Um, you can spend some time researching the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. That was a healing foundation that came out of sort of after the apology was made, and there was I think $300 million that was put towards healing initiatives post residential school for survivors, except it stopped, it sunsetted. That whole initiative sunsetted. And so I've sort of always been of the mind, like, especially now, we need like an Aboriginal Healing Foundation version 2.0 to really support. So each nation will have different ways, but I do think there requires like a robust commitment from this federal government to, and the churches. I want to make that very clear, that it's actually, the Catholic Church has outstanding funds that are owed to Indigenous or to residential school survivors. And it's been a uphill battle for a long time. So there's a whole lot. It's not always, I want to be really clear, this isn't always about like money, but money does provide the supports that are needed to host some of these important programs, right? So I think that it does require a shift in how programs are delivered, but it also requires a really, really critical investment into healing.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll definitely help with the healing process. And what are some of the ways that young people can participate in reconciliation? So we all know the first part, as you had previously mentioned, Chief Adamak, is education and learning about the history, learning about the past. But going forward, what can they do to participate in reconciliation today?
And I don't want to sort of um, come across at all like jaded when I talk about reconciliation, but I will say that like for a lot of Indigenous people, it's just like we're really frustrated with that term. Because people will say it in passing, like, oh, this is reconciliation. And I'm like, what? Like, no, I think we need to be really careful with that term. And this is where I would say to the students who are listening, I will say rather, um, the frame of it, I think, needs to be, let's get to truth before reconciliation. And I really feel like we're at a time in this country where we're still getting to truth. So, how can you participate? Learn, listen, educate, and educate others. And even to some degree, like I know people who are sort of in my generation or older who still don't know. And that may include people like your parents or your aunts or your uncles. And that's hard, right? When you're trying to have those hard conversations with family and if they don't get it or they have their own opinions. Um, but at the end of the day, it's like always about how you approach and like your delivery. And I think that what you can do is like take this time to really learn and make sure you understand and help other people understand. And that to me is part of reconciliation. I think we need to look at reconciliation as like an incredibly long journey that's going to take a lot of steps. But I would say, this Thursday, I'm thinking you may have a holiday. I don't know. Each region's a bit
Yeah.
different. That's a problem, right? In itself, like everyone should have just acknowledged that this needs to be a national day. But like just take some time to think about it and to have that empathy. Like, what if that were me? What if that were my family? How would I feel? it's hard to go through that, but I think we've got to do that as Canadians. And so what I will say to the students is, you're pushing towards reconciliation when you're finding the truth. And so keep finding the truth and keep learning. And that, I think, will be part of you advancing sort of the spirit of reconciliation, because it has become sort of this really frustrating experience, I would say, for a lot of Indigenous people.
Okay. And then just one more question for you, Chief Adamak. Why did you not get an opportunity to learn about your community in grade 8?
Well, this is my story, and we didn't go totally into like my personal story. But like I said, I have, an Indigenous parent and a non-Indigenous parent. And um, the early part of my years I grew up, my mom was a single mom, and I grew up with my non-Indigenous mom. And I had so many questions all the time about like my name, right? My name's Kluani, but I did spend a lot of time myself in Ontario as a young child going to school, and I was in French immersion. So I'm kind of this like oxymoron sometimes, I feel like, because I've got this history that is a very blended history, of all the things, as we're talking about truth and reconciliation. And so when I was in grade 8, I was in French immersion. I wasn't connected to so much my own community. So I'm not the kid that grew up skinning muskrats or going fishing with my grandma. That's not my story. That's some of my cousin's story. My story is one of moving back to the Yukon as a young teenager when I was in grade 9 and reconnecting with my family. And so in grade 8, all we learned about was like Jacques Cartier and like the spice trade. Like that was what we learned in school about Indigenous people. And I would come home and tell my mom, and she would be like, "Oh," but as a non-Indigenous person herself, who was a strong ally of Indigenous people, did her very best to tell me what she could. But that was something I needed to learn, from my dad and my grandmother. And I did. Again, at like 14, we moved back to the Yukon, and I sort of had my high school experience there, and have lived there as an adult for many years. So I'm 35 now, but I can think back to grade 8 and always feeling this sort of uncomfortable rub, because my grandparents also had a century farm that had been in our family for a long time. But I was like the Indigenous, kid that was visibly, compared to a lot of my friends, an Indigenous kid. And, people were always sort of like wanting to know more. So I have, I'm not, I'll maybe pause there. I do have a very perhaps different story than many, in that I didn't grow up with all of the teachings that I would have loved to. But the reason for that was directly linked to residential school. So, my grandmother went home, and what she saw of her community was a whole lot of really sad, a sad reality of a lot of drinking, like a lot of heavy addiction, and her literally being told that she shouldn't be proud of who she is, that her skin was too brown, she should wash it off, like all the most awful things, right, that my grandmother
Mm,
experienced. She was
mhm,
given a number, 26. So she went home to be like, this is it. And so then she didn't learn how to be a parent because she went to residential school. So my dad didn't learn how to be a parent. So it wasn't until my dad was older that he was able to really be able to show up for me in a way that was like healthy and safe. He struggled with his own addictions. So you have to, I think this is the last maybe reflection for students to understand, like, it's not just the residential school survivors, it is their story, it is their experience.
mhm,
And so with that comes their children and their grandchildren, where what they learned and experienced there is then rippled into the next generation and the next generation. And so I think that that's the most important thing here, is that when we say intergenerational survivor, it's people like me who didn't grow up necessarily connected to their community in a way that they would have loved to, or have what would have been most appropriate for them, because of the impacts of residential school. So I'm happy that we sort of took a deep dive, and that I was able to share a bit of my very personal journey, because I think it's very relative, to what it is we're talking about. And there's so many people like me, that for for many different reasons didn't grow up as connected to community as they would have liked to, but have had this sort of journey of reconnection as like young adults.
Well, thank you so much, Chief Adamak, for sharing your journey with us. It was very an inspirational story, and I know the students really benefited from hearing your truths and your story. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone else for participating with us today. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye bye.